Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I welcome my colleague and co-host Larry Kudlow of CNBC. Larry, a very good evening to you. Growth. Growth. It's a simple enough word, and you have spoken of it at great length on your show at CNBC, The Kudlow Report, on your radio show. Is it a message that is everywhere in America, or is that word rarely used now, Larry?
Well, I think it's too rarely used. I mean, some people use it, including yours truly. And I maybe had a hand in talking Governor Pawlenty into talking about strong growth. But unfortunately, the sort of Weltanschauung, the spirit of the time, is to accept almost no growth. And it's sort of a pessimistic, almost declinist view. I heard it tonight again. Jared Bernstein, who is Joe Biden's top economist and a great friend of mine, has returned to CNBC in the Kudlow Report, and he doesn't talk about growth. He gives you all the reasons why we can't grow, which is really too bad, because this country needs growth. It needs it for its spirit. It needs it for jobs. It also needs it to solve our fiscal problems as well.
Larry, we welcome John Taylor. John B. Taylor is the George P. Schultz Senior Fellow in Economics. He's the chair of the Working Group on Economic Policy, member of the Task Force on Energy Policy at the Hoover Institution. Professor Taylor, a very good evening to you, and thank you for this. And recently you posted a very encouraging piece on your blog about why not go for 5% growth. I can presume that this connects to Mr. Pawlenty's remarks of this last week about 5% growth for the United States. First of all, a very good evening to you. And what does 5% growth mean for where we are now, Professor? How does that compare to this new normal we're living in?
Well, it's almost twice as high. We're talking about 2.5%, 3%. It's very slow. Not enough to lower the unemployment rate. Really, not to get us out of where we are. So it would make a tremendous difference to get the higher growth rate. The kind of things Larry mentioned, I agree with.
So, John, let's talk about your good piece, which I really appreciated. And you're saying, in a long-term sense, if we multiply productivity growth times employment growth, and you use reasonable historical benchmarks, we actually can get to 5% overall GDP growth.
I think we can. Obviously, you got to take the right policies and focus on it. But one of the advantages of having a goal like that is you do take the policies and you recognize how important growth is, as you've been saying, and then the ways you do it. You mentioned that it's productivity growth and employment growth. Right now, employment growth is so important with this high unemployment rate, but we can do productivity growth at the same time. It holds month by month, year by year, 10 years by 10 years.
John, decompose this. Let's break it down. First of all, if you want to keep the good productivity growth, 2.7% since the mid-1990s, which is a considerable period of time now. It's about 15 years. What are the best government economic policies to promote good productivity, output per hour, output per worker, that gets us on the path to 5% growth?
Encourage more investment by removing the impediments to investment that businesses face right now. They're sitting on a lot of cash. Making sure that those investments, which is really where the capital comes from, the machines, the computers, that workers have to work with, that raises their productivity, makes them more productive. Second, really encourage more innovation. I live out here in Silicon Valley near Facebook and other big firms, high-tech firms. Encourage them to innovate, because that's where productivity growth comes from as well.
So we see, we see Facebook. We see a lot of these internet companies, social media companies. It's like the next leg of the internet revolution. So why don't we have 5% growth?
Right now, we've got this very high unemployment rate, and productivity growth is starting to move. Believe it or not, it fell somewhat as going into the recession, but as we sit here, people are inventing things. People are applying their ideas and making the economy more productive. But with this very high unemployment rate and not a lot of job growth, you're not taking advantage of that productivity growth to raise GDP as rapidly as you might otherwise do.
I want to provide an historical comparison, Larry and Professor. The percentage of working age population, age 16 and over, that was working as recently as 2001 was 64.7%. Right now, it's 58.4%. You argue, Professor, that if we just got back to 2001, we would have encouraged more than 2% growth. Is that correct?
Yes, you basically have population growing about 1% during the next 10 years or so. That's an estimate from census. And then you add the 1% as a larger fraction of the workforce comes into work. And so both of those together give you the 2%, which is a big increase.
And combining that with productivity growth, that gets to the 5%. So, Larry, this doesn't seem unattainable to get to where we were in 2001. That isn't lost forever in the darkness.
Well, these are some of the things I spoke to with Governor Pawlenty, and I may have been one of the guys that put him up to this. I'm astonished, John. You know, you've been in this game, policy and politics, as I have. I'm astonished how many critics Pawlenty bumped up against, including conservative critics. There's a whole debate raging in my magazine and website, National Review, I'm in the minority, if you want to know the truth. Why do you reckon people think 5% growth is so out of touch, out of hand, out of sight?
I think there tends to be naysayers out there about things like this. But one of the reasons to go through these productivity numbers and employment growth numbers is to make people realize this is something that's achievable if we put our minds to it. I think, economists tend to sometimes be a little green eye shade about this and looking through the details, not recognizing that a goal itself will help achieve the goal. So I also am somewhat surprised and disappointed a little bit that people don't take this as a positive. But, the good part is we're now paying more attention to growth. This debate is good in the sense people will say, hey, growth's important.
What's the budget impact? Suppose you could grow 5%. Let's just say for 5 years, John Taylor. What would the budget impact be?
Well, it would be huge. You can get the budget as a share of GDP down, which is what we're trying to do, by having more GDP. Right now, GDP growth is so low that you've got to reduce spending even more. But if you double GDP growth, then, of course, you could bring spending down more rapidly. Just some numbers here. In the year 2000, we had government spending, federal spending, 18.2% of GDP. It's now way up to 24%. And some good budget plans like Pawlenty or Ryan take it down back to around 18-19%. But you can do that much better by having higher growth than with lower economic growth. It's a big part of the picture.
John, you were on, maybe you're still on the advisory council for the Congressional Budget Office, and I recall in the CBO scoring mechanisms that if you, if you grow the economy at 1% faster than the CBO baseline, which is, I think, about 2.5%, if you grew at 1% faster, John, over 10 years, you would cut the deficit by almost $3 trillion, which is roughly half of Paul Ryan's budget cuts. Do you buy into that?
Well, sure. It's just arithmetic, quite frankly. I'm not on the panel right now, but that's really what happens. You get more tax revenue with more income, and more income comes from more growth. Very much part of why it's easier to balance the budget in a strong economy than otherwise. Think about how large the deficit is now because of this weak economy.
I was just going to ask you, if you were going to construct a set of policies to get this growth, where would you start? Tick off your key policy measures.
Well, there's four things. I think you do have to bring spending down into more historical levels, like, say, 24 down to 19% of GDP. That would immediately remove a lot of the risks of higher inflation, higher taxes, higher probability of crisis. Then, number two, I would work on the tax code, get those marginal tax rates down. That'll encourage investment and demonstrate the fact the government doesn't want to increase taxes. Third, I go on the regulations, and including the new healthcare regulations. The new healthcare has been an impediment already, plus financial regulations, and finally monetary policy. I think monetary policy is key here to removing a lot of the uncertainty and risks. I'd like to go back to a more rules-based policy like we saw in the 80s and 90s.
John Taylor is the George Shultz Senior Fellow in Economics at the Hoover Institution. He teaches at Stanford University. Larry Kudlow of Kudlow Reports at CNBC and Kudlow Radio on the weekend. And when we come back, growth for all the candidates, not just Mr. Pawlenty, all the candidates, and what can we look for in the coming presidential campaign that is positive for the American worker. I'm John Batchelor.